Okay, so the next speaker is Prof Mukund Thattai, Mukund obtained his BA in physics from Cornell University and a PhD from MIT in 2004. Since 2004, he's been at the National Center for Biological Sciences. His research explores the origin and evolution of cellular life on Earth. Mukund has been deeply involved in public engagement efforts and the arts and science interaction and collaborations. And he's worked with conceptual artists and theater practitioners to explore the practice of biology and its impact on society. He's been involved with the Science and Society program at NCBS and the Science Gallery Bengaluru initiative, as well as many other related things. So he will share both his experiences and the perspective on public engagement arising from these interactions and experiences. So he'll talk about a public engagement roadmap for scientists.
Thank you, Srikant. And thank you very much for having me here. It's an honor. I'm a practicing scientist. I'm not a scholar of science and society. So again, that disclaimer that what I will tell you are things I've learned from my own experiences in trying to engage. And I guess I'll put the most important lesson up first. What it took me some time to realize is I am first and foremost a member of society, not primarily a scientist. And apart from my own niche subject, which I studied in my lab, what my colleague down the hall or at a neighboring institution or at the government departments do, it's fully my right to question their, why they exist and why I should fund them with my taxpayer money. And once you flip around to thinking of it in that way, then public engagement becomes much better because you see it from the other side. And I think the title of this journal is very cleverly chosen, but the extended title, Science, Scientists, and Society, contains a little bit of a hint of why the problems exist that the journal is trying to address in the first place. I think this us and them needs to be removed a little bit. So I apologize for starting with this uncomfortable note. My excuse, of course, is that the point of dialogue is to make people uncomfortable. Otherwise, we call it a duet, right? So I think, in fact, the title of the journal is very appropriate and apt, and it will do great things. So this has happened to all of us in this room who've been scientists, right? So you're out somewhere, and you're speaking to somebody, and suddenly it turns out that you're a scientist, and they look at you, and they say, oh, you're a scientist. And they pause, and maybe sometimes they'll say, well, I've never met a scientist before, and they sort of push at you a little bit, and usually that's the end of it, and they wander on. But occasionally, you might grab their attention, and sort of, let's see what happens next. Sometimes it's actually nice. Whoever this person is, who's evidently not a scientist, stops and says, wow, what's it like? And then you think, oh, I haven't thought about that, but let me try and explain. And if you wait too long, well, they go away. But if you manage to catch their attention there, then they manage to ask, what? They figure out that you are actually studying something. Many people don't understand that's what scientists do. So what do you study? And so you have a short amount of time to have an answer to that. And if you get a hook, then you have a discussion with them. But if you don't, then they leave. And finally, there's this question. Why is that useful? And at that point, sometimes the scientist walks out. And then you lose the chance for dialogue, right? So this is not unusual. This is absolutely routine. And so we keep on losing opportunities to have a discussion. And so here's the point, right? This is not something which should be surprising. This kind of reaction from somebody who's not a scientist is completely expected given how we project ourselves and how we've comported ourselves in public, okay? I mean, just think about it. So when scientists talk, we do talk quite a lot. We're trained to talk. Here's what we tend to do here's what we ought to do. Even if we start to have a discussion with somebody, we tend to dumb it down. We start with, well, that's hard to explain, but, I'll give it a shot. Instead of dumbing it down, here's a phrase I learned recently. You should open it up, right? You should start with the fact that somebody's asked you a question that should make you feel very happy, which it does often. And you should realize that's a rare and beautiful thing. And you should say, thanks for asking. Mean it. And then go on to explain what it is you do, right? No matter how complicated it is, because if they're interested, they will listen. Here's the other thing we do. We ignore the question. There's lots of people who constantly ask what it is we do. And after a while, we say, well, I have to go write my papers. I don't have time for this. And this is very bad and very dangerous. Somebody else is giving you time, and you should, again, respect that and respond. So instead of ignoring the question and saying, I'm too busy, it's true you're too busy, right? What you should tell them is, God, I'm so busy. People keep looking at the paper I'm publishing instead of this great discovery I'm about to make. And, my students are suffering because of this UGC requirement, whereas we're on the cusp of, And so you explain so that people can empathize with the fact that you're a scientist and you go through the same highs and lows and you're not sort of a caricature of a scientist. You have the same daily experience as many other people working in the creative arts, sciences, and other kinds of fields. So don't ignore the question. Convey why you do it. It's actually quite easy once you start to talk. You'll find just, well, after the first 5 minutes of complaining, then you start to talk about all the positive things. Here's the other thing, which Professor Narasimha alluded to. We get entitled and defensive, and this also, unfortunately, happens all the time. Somebody says, why is it useful? And you interpret that as a criticism. It's not a criticism, it's a question. You shouldn't tell them, you trust the experts. It's useful, and I can't explain why it's useful. And of course, you should fund us, right? I'm not going to tell you why, but of course you should fund us. Yeah? Now, don't think of it that way. Think of another scientist coming and asking you for your taxpayer money, and they tell you, of course you should fund us. And you say, no, you explain to me why this machine is supposed to do what it's doing. So why not give the same respect to a member of the public? So you should convince them why it matters. Here are the short-term benefits. Here are the long-term benefits. Perhaps there are no long-term benefits in the point of view you're thinking about, say, industrial applications, but certainly in terms of discovering where humans came from or where galaxies come from. These are the long-term benefits of doing the work, right? And if you actually take the trouble to do this, I assure you, because if you do take the trouble, this actually works. And whoever it is you're having a discussion with goes away with a deeper understanding of what you did. They become an advocate for you. They go and tell somebody else, oh, I met a scientist, and they're not, as scary as you thought, and, I had this really long and interesting discussion, and my God, and they even drink wine, and, this is, it's very, very surprising. So that's the bit about talking science, and we've heard a lot about how scientists should talk from Professor Balram. Here's the problem, though. This kind of thing is actually becoming better and better. So scientists are being taught how to talk, how to write, how to communicate, and it's becoming fairly good, the DST requirement notwithstanding. But we rarely listen, okay? We actually never do it. I mean, apart from listening to our own colleagues. We do not go out, and when we think about engaging, negotiating, talking with the public, we don't go out with the idea that I'm going to go change my mind about how the situation is. You go out thinking, I'm going to go, at best explain to people how it is, and maybe they'll get excited by it, right? So why should we listen? There's many, many reasons, and here's just a few. This word contract or compact, I like the word compact better, but you renegotiate the scientific compact. So science is publicly funded, and therefore it is fully within the rights of members of the public and the governments and their representatives to ask us why we do what we do. And that's our chance to explain to them. It's to make a case. And you can make a case saying, well, it may not be application, but it may be the same reason you fund science is the reason you fund sport or the arts. There are broad cultural reasons, or for obvious industrial reasons and medical reasons and so on, right? So that negotiation, I'm sorry, there's a G missing there. That negotiation can only happen if you listen. You can't tell people what the scientific compact is supposed to be. You can say, how can we meet halfway with what the science, with state, society, and scientists are able to do for each other? This negotiation hasn't really happened. We tend to be running on an autopilot, okay? There's a way that funding bodies work. There's a way that these local systems work by which you justify your existence, and there's no need for us to become so uncomfortable to go out and say, why should society fund us? Here's the other thing which is, slightly more obvious. If you don't keep your eyes and ears open, this is that Pasteur quadrant, if you don't keep your eyes and ears open, then you might be sitting on a fantastic discovery, which, by the way, accidentally and very thrillingly might be useful. And if you're not aware of what society needs and what it finds useful, you're not going to be able to make that connection and make that hit. And I'm telling you, it's not so hard and it's not so boring to go and find out what it is that society needs and what it finds useful. There's any number of places where you can read and understand what the problems facing the world today are. Most of the time, 99.9%, you're not going to be the person who's able to solve those problems. But if you're aware, that is that listening part, even if you don't solve, you communicate to somebody and somebody else realizes they have the solution and somehow you are part of that whole process. That's something that scientists should engage in. It's a very worthwhile thing to do. Finally, I think this is actually very interesting. The way we do science, there is a sense in which we copy a very academic, perhaps a Western model of what it means to publish papers, to do peer review, the metrics that we try to strive for. And I found, and I'll give you a couple of stories of this, that the public actually have very interesting new ways to imagine what scientists could do. Now, science 300 years ago was the absolute Wild West, right? Scientists didn't all look like scientists. They all just ended up doing whatever they wanted. And, you know, this crazy mixed up process eventually developed into this very systematic way of producing knowledge, or at least some kind of output that we call science today. Why not go back to that crazy type of science? Why not go back to this crazy world in which we still have our labs, we still have rigor, we still have questions that we ask, we still have processes, but we inject a completely new creative dimension. Now, where does that dimension come from? Unfortunately, we've lost that muscle. It doesn't come from us, and it can come from the outside world if we go look for it. So here's 3 ways in which listening to the public is actually not the public, just listening to people who are not you, can actually change the way you do science in an entirely positive way. So we should listen. There's been a lot said about this this paper, which surprisingly hasn't been mentioned today, but this Vannevar Bush in the US in the 1940s and 50s. So he published this statement manifesto called Science, the Endless Frontier, which led to the forming of the National Science Foundation. And this is often used by many people as a way to justify the public funding of science to the public. And what Bush's claim was that you could clearly see that large-scale public investment in fundamental questions in science, just repeatedly you can see the pattern where it has led to great public good in terms of useful applications, right? And so he calls this Science, the Endless Frontier. Now, this is a problem. First of all, it's very old. And secondly, you know, it's done by a bunch of men in a room in a university a very long time ago. That idea, that context of Science, the Endless Frontier, a lot of it is correct today, but a lot of it has changed, okay? And we haven't gone back to get another very big case to sustain the funding of science, if even in 2017, half the conferences I go to, this is the justification people use to say why the public should fund science. You shouldn't be citing a paper written in the 1940s and 50s. Okay? So, well, I was having this discussion by Twitter with Amitabh, where he said, well, you know, the word public engagement is a bit adversarial. We're talking about the front lines between science and society. And I was thinking, well, it is a bit adversarial, right? So we have now, you know, drawn these lines ourselves. We put ourselves in a situation where we seem to be fighting, maybe not fighting, but certainly negotiating our role with society, right? The 20th century compact about why scientists should justify their existence, how they do it, no longer applies. I mean, just for an example, these military priorities that were clearly in people's minds in the 40s and 50s have now been replaced by broader types of goals. There's no framework within science. There is no framework within the practice of science to discuss ethics, impact, prioritization, inclusiveness, or advocacy. That are things you do in your own time, okay? It's not something that you do as a scientist. So that's in your own mind. Your public self and your science self come into conflict. And we've not been trained to deal with this conflict. The goals of the public do not necessarily, in fact, rarely, for example, the measurement of the radius of the proton, do not necessarily align with the goals of individual scientists, right? This is very common. There's nothing wrong with that, but it is something we have to negotiate. Finally, and this everybody knows, scientists are increasingly preoccupied with an artificial reward system. By the way, this painting over here is a painting of the first operation with ether. And if you look at the recent history of medicine, it wasn't just adversarial. It was positively brutal, the way scientists brutalized, not in the case of ether, but for example, in the case of gynecology, patients for the goal of generating knowledge, and none of these questions were discussed. Okay, so it being adversarial, it's not an adversary. Adversarial is just a term, but there are people involved in the dialogue. Who are the people on the other side? Unfortunately, the people we tend to talk to right now are the politicians, they're the people in Delhi, and so on. Those aren't the people you should be, I mean, of course you go through the process to get funded, but really you should be talking directly to the people, okay? Not directly to the technocrats, bureaucrats, or politicians, because when it comes down to it, it's the people who are going to support you. And if the people support you, then you can have the correct kind of discussion with those who represent the people. Okay, so now I've made the case that there is an entire range of ways in which we are meant to have the dialogue, the discussion, and so on. There's an entire spectrum. Many of us do many of these things. I'm just going to go through the entire list. So first of all, there's these things in white. These are things that most scientists I know do all the time. They enjoy doing it. science communication, whether in the press or giving talks and so on, or on TV, radio, science popularization, writing books, popular articles, science outreach, open days, bringing schools, students in and teaching them how machines work and so on. So these are things we tend to do and in fact are quite locally rewarded for doing. Now on the other side, the other kinds of engagement you might have with politicians in society and so on, you could be called to consult on a project of national importance, and that's interesting and useful. You might make a contribution. Somewhere along the way, there's also the matter of government oversight into the kind of work you're doing, and there's sort of weak boundaries between these two things. And you know, rather dangerously, there's this end of the thing, which is control, the control of science by the people in charge of the money. Now, the problem is doing this does not at all give you a way to control the outcome of that, okay? Because these two things happen in two completely different rooms, okay? This is happening in the corridors of power where the public and the funders and civil society and everybody else has a discussion. This is happening in very easy venues, schools and colleges, and these are, you know, safe spaces for us. Somewhere in the middle, we need to do all this stuff, and that's what engagement means. It's the boundary. Engagement. You need to engage between these two spaces. Engage that word contains friction. It's not easy. Dialogue, which means back and forth. You need to talk and listen. Advocacy. There's nothing wrong with scientists having political points of view. You should be come from your role as a member of society. But still, you have a right, the full right to start to use both those aspects of yourself to have this dialogue. I think that's another very dangerous thing. We're sort of taught that you're not supposed to get mixed up emotionally and politically in the output of your work, and that's totally wrong. So this is the space that we are trying to encourage, and that's the kind of space that a journal like this is going to participate in fully, especially with the idea of, I think, the wonderful idea of having confluence, which is an active dialogue with the public while the scholarly work is being published. Okay, so now I'm going to talk about the easy bit, which is science communication, outreach, popularization, and then I'm going to talk about the harder bits based on some stories which I can tell you of things I've been trying over the many years. So this is Alan Alda. He plays MASH, Hawkeye Pierce in this TV show MASH, but in his current life, he's actually a huge advocate of science communication. He teaches scientists how to communicate, and he has this famous line. He says, communication is not something you add on to science. It is the very essence of science. He runs something in Stony Brook called the Alda Center for Communication of Science. And I think in the last several years, there's been an absolute renaissance in available resources for students and scientists to teach themselves how to become better science communicators, just like better science writers, the books that you saw. And in fact, locally, there's been a boom in really good science, popular science, science in the press, right? I mean, it's been really wonderful to see. So communication and science journalism, so for example, The Wire is a wonderful place you go for good popular science articles about things that are being done locally. Transdisciplinary University has just started one of the first fellowships for people who want to learn how to become science journalists. There's a science journalism workshop that Anil Ananthaswamy runs at NCBS every year. And then there's a young crop of science journalists who've now come up who are really breaking the mold of what it means to do science. So, of course, Pallav is an established and seasoned science journalist, and he's been working to not just popularize science, but critique science for many, many years. Now, people like Ashima or Priyanka or Vasudev Mukund or Shubha, they've been using the modern availability, not just of print newspapers, but the availability of online magazines and many other, and social media and many other ways of communicating with the public to really revamp what it means to convey science to the public, and I think they're doing a fantastic job. They should really be commended for this. So that's communication. Now here's outreach and popularization, another thing that scientists enjoy doing, and they actually get locally rewarded to do it. And apart from very famous popularizers of science, this is Carl Sagan, he's the reason I'm doing science. Bill Nye, the science guy, this is Neil deGrasse Tyson, Brian Cox, and we have our local popularizers, of course, Yashpal. This is Anil Ananthaswamy, who's a science writer. He writes for New Scientist. He also writes books about complicated scientific topics that are very beautifully readable and accessible. And Arnab at TFR, who started the Chai and Why series, where they go into town and they tell people who want to show up in an evening what kind of science scientists do. So this is outreach and popularization of science. Now, what I want to say about all these things, which is communication and outreach, it makes you feel good, right? It doesn't just make you feel good. It makes you into a rock star. Okay? So this is National College Baswangudi, where the Bangalore Science Forum has been running for decades without fail. And whenever they ask me to go give a talk, I give a talk. And this is a fantastic venue. But these days, if you're a scientist, you actually get called to the Bangalore Lit Fest. You get called by comedians to sit on panels with filmmakers, right? And you get on Twitter and you get all these followers and you feel, I mean, it's amazing. It's an ego boost and you think I'm doing absolutely everything I can to communicate science. But you're not. This is not what you want to do. This is totally self-serving. This is just you going out and telling people what scientists do, and it's just great, and you should absolutely listen to us, right? That's not what you should be doing. You should be doing something slightly harder, slightly more difficult, slightly more adversarial. So now I'm going to tell you the series of harder things that if you choose to, you could engage with, apart from just science communication. And there are many, many ways to do it, and there are many resources that will support you. For example, the Wellcome Trust UK has been a long-term public supporter of what they call science engagement. One of the things they do is they support, so I know telling stories was belittled earlier, but this has a particular context. They support theater science projects where they support residencies of playwrights who sit on campuses for weeks, maybe months. They develop complicated scientific ideas like antimicrobial resistance or bacteriophage into plays that involve actual human emotion and human contexts. So it's not to dumb down the ideas, but it's to give somebody a hook to want to go watch a play, which is not about science, it's about people, but it has science as one aspect of it. So I was very lucky to be a scientific advisor on these two plays, and it's a fantastic experience. This still lies on the side of self-serving science. You want to take a message that you want to convey to the public. Antimicrobial resistance is a big, difficult problem. Don't overuse antibiotics. And you work with people who are good at communication and writing to convey that idea. But that's still you as a scientist telling the public what to do. There are other things that you could do. And again, this is something which the journal will probably get involved with. My own experience with a harder part of the interface is indirect, but NCBS runs a science and society program. And the goal of the Science and Society program is to bring scholars from the humanities and from the social sciences and have real, rigorous discussion, dialogue, scholarship emerging from it by getting scientists, natural scientists, to talk to social scientists or humanities scholars to generate new ways of thinking, new frameworks, new ideas, difficult questions, and so on. The end point of this is stuff that looks very familiar to academia, which is colloquia, seminar series, publications which people can later access. And again, this is not easy because the language barrier, the two worlds, the language barrier that exists between science and the social sciences, the fact that I use a laptop and a PowerPoint presentation and I don't just read from notes, and these are things that put people off for a long time. This kind of dialogue, real dialogue, takes, and real scholarship is extremely difficult, no matter where in the world it is, and I think it's a great goal if this journal is able to set the standard and the bar with its first few editions for what this kind of dialogue would mean, because that would then generate role models for other people to follow and emulate, to have more meetings like this, to have more dialogues like this. Okay? Now, this is precisely where you can go ask the public, what do you think scientists are doing wrong, and what do you think scientists are doing correct? What do you think is useful about the practice of science? What is dangerous about the practice of science? Now, here's the bit that I find most fun and exciting. Good, I have time. So this is my own hobby. Many years ago, I was contacted by people at the Srishti School of Art, Design and Technology, which is just down the road from NCBS, and they wanted to know if NCBS would be open to having an artist in residence program. And I said, that's absolutely fine. So you'd have to give the artist a room, and presumably they would come and they would paint something, I guess, and they would go away. But of course, that's not the kind of artist that one is talking about. So this was a residency program that eventually grew into something that was a decade-long collaboration between myself and Yashas Shetty at Srishti. He's a conceptual artist. And the point of conceptual art is not particularly dependent on the medium, but it is back to this very important idea of making people uncomfortable and getting deep to the heart of a question. And what he was saying was that by being at NCBS, he sees the practice of biology as somebody with fresh eyes. And what he saw were people in every lab, just students, PhD students, first-year PhD students show up. They do a few things with tubes and pipettes and so on, and they're able to inject, to pick out a gene from one organism, inject into another organism, and then go home for lunch without being totally astonished at what they just did. And this lack of astonishment at something which should be deeply astonishing was something that started to puzzle him. So his point of view was, well, let's take the stuff that they do on a daily basis and use it to do something almost subversive, right? Let's do a scientific experiment in the sense use the methods of science, but which has no scientific goal. It's not part of an experimental design. Let's make genetically modified organisms that have no goal other than to either entertain or to make you think in some strange way. Right? So this was the birth of what became the Smell of Rain project, where we genetically modified E. coli bacteria to make the smell of the monsoon rains by inserting a particular type of gene in there. Or we modified worms to move differently on a petri dish, and therefore the tracks they made looked almost like the brush strokes of different artists by knocking down certain muscle proteins. I mean, this was crazy stuff. And you would almost get into legal trouble for doing this kind of thing, right? So we didn't, and we won't. But the point is, this kind of work is not directly beneficial to the scientists. It's not directly supported by the institutional frameworks. In fact, they get quite uncomfortable by it. We got lots of questions saying, how are you getting funding for that when I'm not getting funding for my project? But we made people uncomfortable. And in the end, these things actually ended up in museums of science around the world. So this is work that we produced here in Bangalore, are now bioart exhibits at various places. And literally, we could only have done it in India because these kinds of mixings of different disciplines without worrying too much about long-term, well, at least not too much long-term stuff, is still something for the moment we preciously have within our scientific institutions, and we should not lose it. So what I mean by this is, if you engage with these artists, I tell you, you will come away with a deeper appreciation of your own practice of science. You'll come away with a deeper understanding of why you do what you do. And it could be that the artist has interpreted the science in such a way that the public understand that the scientist is now no longer self-serving. The message that comes out of this is a message that is interpreted by an artist of what is going on a scientific campus. And so not automatically discounted by the member of the public saying, oh, obviously that's what they would say. They'd say, this is interesting, it points to some dangerous aspects, but some useful aspects of science. I am now willing to talk to you more. If you're so open-minded that you can talk to an artist, you can certainly talk to me. Okay, so this then brings us to the last bit of what I want to talk about, which is quite important. So I was in London to visit someone I know at Imperial College in the maths department, and so Imperial College is right next to the Science Museum. They have a very nice foyer and an entrance with a group of people who sit as receptionists at computers. So I walked up to one of them and I said, I'd like to meet a mathematician. And I was about to tell her the name of the mathematician. And so she misunderstood. She said, oh, you'd like to meet a mathematician? Sit down. Here's a bunch of them. And which type of mathematician would you like to meet today? And this was interesting because she thought that I was just somebody who walked over from the Science Museum and I just was there to come visit Imperial and have a fun afternoon. Science is fun. And apparently that happens all the time. Now, how nice would it be if you could do this in Bangalore? Right? Because the Bangalore Science Forum does it. It's true. Every Wednesday, there are people who come there from all walks of society. Perhaps the average age is old. But there are people who go there to learn from scientists what they do. There is a huge demand for this. Okay? But those venues are traditional. They are one-way delivery points. Okay? Open days, science forum, and so on is projecting science. What you need is a neutral space, which is not in a science campus, and yet is not sort of in the Vidhan Saudha, let's say, where you can have an uncomfortable discussion, and you can bring artists, and you can bring scientists, and you can bring members of the public, and have a sustained interaction. So you need to know that it will always be around. So several years ago, the government of Karnataka actually entered into an agreement with partners being the Indian Institute of Science, NCBS, the Srishti School, to set up a new science museum for Bangalore, a non-traditional science museum, because it is first and foremost just a space. It's a publicly accessible space. You can walk in and walk out anytime. It's a space where the exhibits will change constantly. It's a space where you can be assured that when you walk in, it won't be the same exhibit you saw last time, but it will be timely. It could be about poisons or antibiotics or about the diameter of the proton. I don't know. So this is an experience I had at Science Gallery Dublin, which was the first museum of this type of which we are now a network partner. And this was just fascinating for me. Science Gallery Dublin is on a busy stretch of road just outside Trinity College, and they have a nice cafeteria. And what you have inside are scientists and artists who've set up exhibits, and they stay for residencies of 2 weeks or a month or something. And when nobody's walking in, they work on something. with the artists. So they have a collaboration going on. But when somebody walks in, they stop what they're doing, and they have a long discussion with people over coffee. And it's free, by the way. And so we should hope that it's going to be free over here. I'm not sure about that. So Science Gallery is actually going to be just down the road from here, just past Makery Circle. And to develop the exhibits, along with this network of museums around the world, including Dublin, London, Australia, and so on, we need students to get involved, PhD students to make the exhibits. We need design students and artists to make sure the exhibits are not, again, one-way exhibits, but things that stimulate two-way discussion. Okay, so having been funded by the Wellcome Trust on multiple occasions, I've been invited twice to what they call the International Public Engagement Workshop. This one happened in 2016. And the Public Engagement Workshop is where Wellcome Trust brings people they have funded. In many cases, people who have had several decades of experience working with communities, often medical practitioners, working with communities to develop a public engagement program. So these are scientists or medical doctors, but real experts in public engagement. And it was my privilege to sit in a room with them for several days, the outcome of which was a document, which in many ways is a roadmap for science. It's a publicly available document, which I'll share with Srikanth, and then those of you who are here can actually read more about what's in here. But I'm going to give you a few snapshots. What I want to show you here is the people who eventually had a successful public engagement practice. What did they end up telling us? So for example, what do you think is the main benefit of researchers engaging with the public? It's a fair question because I'm busy, right? Is it worth my time? So for example, to learn from public groups and ensure that research is relevant to society. This is interesting, okay? To inform the public and raise awareness about research. These are things we can all agree in, right? To maintain public support for research. Right? So these are the kinds of things that I've just discussed. And public engagement experts, people who've had a successful practice, say that they've achieved these outcomes over the years. These are not just pipe dreams. What are the main challenges, though? Not everybody can become a public engagement expert off the bat. My advice to you is don't get involved on your own. Get involved with the community or a set of people who've done this before. Get involved with a funding agency that knows what it's doing, like the Wellcome Trust, and they'll help you put it together. But for example, of course, just the support structure is not there, right? So there aren't people who can help you do all these other things apart from being a scientist. Funding support, infrastructural support, just reward structures in terms of being promoted or not promoted if you waste your time doing that kind of work. Finally, what would most encourage you to get involved? If it was easier for me to get funds, right? So this is a standard scientific question and a standard scientific answer. And this is interesting for a body like the Wellcome Trust because their immediate response was, we saw value in this, we will give you funds. So there are funds available. There is literally no excuse not to do it. Wellcome Trust is particularly interested in biomedical sciences, but I'm sure similar things can happen in other disciplines. Okay, so I'll stop now. So here's something I learned from Michael John Gorman, who was at the time the director of Science Gallery in Dublin. This is the long room at Trinity College, Dublin. It's an absolutely fantastic place. If you go to Dublin, go and visit. This is where they keep the Book of Kells as a manuscript in the back. And if you go in, you immediately get hit with this, you know what I'm talking about, right? This familiar smell of the hallowed halls of academia, right? Everybody can imagine what I'm talking about, right? You know what that is? You know where that comes from? A lack of ventilation. Okay. So what that means is that scientists need to get out some more, okay? This is a bad sign, yeah? So, and I'm glad that this is a good start. I'm happy to continue the dialogue. You can reach me at that handle on Twitter. And I'll stop here. Thank you.
Okay. I see a few hands here. 1, 2, 3. Okay, 4. Okay.
So you mentioned at some point entitlement, and you also mentioned the absence of a framework to talk about ethics and diversity and inclusion. As a practicing scientist, I mean, it's my experience and impression that our structures in India are actually such that they reinforce both the sense of entitlement and the sort of absence or the sort of absence of a need even for a framework to discuss ethics and diversity and exclusion. So What are your thoughts on what a journal like this can do to break that pattern?
My message has been anything. It is that a journal like this can have only a limited effect of that kind of thing. Okay, a journal like this can do scholarship, but the type of thing you're talking about happens in the trenches, and it's not directly something that can happen here. What a journal like this can do is provide a forum for reporting the results of interventions to deal with such things. Okay, and maybe add some rigor to the effort, right? But it's not the solution. I don't have an answer for you. I actually dispute, though, that it's worse in India than other places. Because here, I believe we're more confronted with things outside than in other places where people are even more cocooned than we are. So,
I just had two questions. One is when you talk about taking science to the people, in a sense, and are you really suggesting that the people can inform? So because science has grown far from being a Wild West type of scenario, right? I mean, it is evolved knowledge. And
I'm
so
really suggesting that people can inform.
Okay, so that's not clear. And
we can discuss.
Okay. The other thing is about communication. The examples that you've given seem mostly very urbane.
Yeah.
And
yeah.
You have not mentioned, for example, a lot of very important work done by the Kerala Shastra Sahitya Parishad, for example, or even things that happen more in the rural hinterland of India. Which is where perhaps the future scientific talent of India is going to come from.
Fully agree, and this is my limitation, my lack of scholarship, and therefore I would have been able to choose these things better if I had been better trained in that kind of thing, right? But absolutely, these small interventions locally in cities with a certain sliver of society in certain languages are not going to do the job that we are hoping they'll do. But more so supports my point that we need to get out and get more uncomfortable.
Yeah, actually, my question is very linked to what you just.
Oh,
yeah,
sorry.
Hi.
Hello.
Yeah, hi. So I was also going to ask you something similar to what was just asked, but then I thought, since you talked about the science gallery, so a lot of the good practices that you mentioned by NCBS and the whole cross-disciplinary and stuff, a lot of stuff that I have gone to and enjoyed and appreciated, but I always, go out and, I mean, I do wonder a little bit, is this actually reaching the public that you depicted in your slide with the railway station and the people? And I feel like there is an opportunity to do that with the gallery, where maybe reach more of the middle class, less, more of the non-elite in a way that's not intimidating or patronizing. So if I was curious to know whether the gallery had any plans to
so at the moment it doesn't even exist, and therefore it's open to having a discussion about what it should be doing. And that's the beauty of it, right? And in fact, I think the railways are a very good, not just analogy, but actually a practical way to have some of this discussion about how to spread science. Of course, there is the science train and things like that, right? But that's a bit simple. We need to sit and have this discussion with the director and experts, and I'm not an expert on how to do it best. But it's an open discussion.
Yeah, I just wanted you to comment on the ethical framework that one should embrace while, working with science and art, more specifically with your interaction with Srishti School.
Yeah.
When, you spoke about...
So in biology, when people talk of ethics, they mainly talk about something called bioethics, which is not ethics, but is a set of procedural guidelines, which we adhere to completely. In biology, ethics is still being written, and therefore we might be slightly on the uncomfortable side of what people would like to do, and that's precisely the point, to then redefine what the society would find acceptable uses of very powerful biological technologies. Biologists themselves are not equipped to have these discussions. Artists and ethicists are required participants in these discussions. Yeah.
Okay, I think we will stop at this point.